participatory approaches for young people. So we're Partnership for Young London with a regional youth unit for London. And over the past 2 years, funded by Trust for London, we've been supporting organisations to conduct their own participatory research with young people. So we've supported projects that are kind of 6 months long, 2 months long, and one which was 2 weeks. And through that and doing kind of all these different models and hearing about other people and participatory work they've done, we've kind of gathered some data and we've created a peer research review, which we're releasing in June the 5th in a final report, which spoke to about 20 organisations about the processes that they used and their approach when it came to conducting participatory approaches. So we'll be releasing that in June, and some of this is basically based on the findings from that, as well as literary reviews. I'll be sending around the presentation as well as the link to the recorded webinar today. And what we'll do is there's 4 sections. And at the end of each section, if you have any questions, if you could put them in the chat, my colleague Troy. Hello, Troy.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Troy. We'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll do 2 questions at the end of each part, and then at the end we'll be around if anyone has any other questions. If that sounds good. So generally the things that we're going to go over is first kind of keep it very basic. What is participation? Trying to clear up some of the confusion around co-production versus participatory research, and forms of participation with young people, specifically looking at peer research and the way that kind of participatory research with young people can be applied in different contexts. Part 2, we'll have a look at why use participatory research, kind of a basic drawdown of the benefits for the research perspective, the benefits of the young people, and some of the drawbacks. Part 3, that's supposed to change that, is good practice in participatory working. So again, we're just touching on it today as an introduction, but thinking about what meaningful participation is, the idea of representative sampling and how that works in this context, having a look at the process as a whole, what a process looks like, and what kind of support and training is needed in this when doing it. And part 4 is just kind of really quick looking at challenges. So the practicalities in terms of staffing, budget and time, and some of the limitations of using this approach. So if I go on part 1 first. So how can young people participate? So I put a big definition there, again, we'll share down the slides. But when looking at what is participation, some of the general ideas that come out is firstly, the involvement of those intended. So whoever the research is about, whoever is going to be impacted by the decisions are the ones that are involved in the process, involved in the research. And that's mainly about redressing this democratic deficit between sort of the studies and the academics studying them. So it's about empowering those participations as equal partners in the process, take control of the process and ask the questions they want to ask and analyze the data as they find it. So therefore, because they're involved in that research process and they have a sense of ownership over it, hopefully they'll go on to be a part of the decision-making process itself and see how that process takes place in an evidence-based way. So the World Health Organization in 2019 defined it partly as empowering communities to retain ultimate control over key decisions. While Price and Milas back in 1991, a lot of the original reading comes out in the early 90s in a meaningful way, was involved of intended beneficiaries in the planning, design, implementation, and subsequent maintenance. That's kind of basic. In terms of the common features, if you go through all the literature reviews, the same kind of things come up again and again. The first one is the sense of voluntary. One of the most important parts of participatory research is the sense of agency. So you're giving over agency. They want to be involved, they want to make a difference in their community, and they want to find out more. So generally you can't get them to be coerced into it, and you can't force them to do it. They want to, you can encourage it through remunerations, which we'll touch on, but generally they get involved because they want to. The second one is about action. So we call it peer research, but it's more known theoretically in academia as participatory action research. So this is about there needs to be some sort of change built in at the end of the process from the very beginning. It isn't research for research's sake. There needs to be some sort of tangible thing that they can see change as a result of it, or some sort of decision. The third one is about collective or connected. So it's all about the networks. You're using those young people because they may have networks in other areas and email, and it's about building relationships within that community. Because if you want to have that representative sample and you want your research to be very strong, then you need to make sure you're reaching the right people and you're also recruiting those right young people. And purposeful, also similar to about action, there is a consequence at the end of the research. Those are kind of the common features. So the one question is always, there's a lot of confusion around the terms. So there's participatory action research, there's community action research, there's peer research, there's participatory grant making, there's co-production, and it can get really confusing. So we won't watch this video now, but it's two academics, Nick Jenkins and Peter Matthews, and they talk about the difference between the two approaches. For them, co-production involves forms of knowledge being brought together, but participatory research aims to challenge and disrupt power relationships found in more traditional research that draws a rigid distinction between researchers and people being researched. So generally, participatory research tends to see itself as more disrupting of traditional power structures. It is kind of less sometimes an equal partnership, where it's not about managing the organizational aims and the young people's aims, but it's simply handing over the process completely to those young people for them to make decisions and set the aims themselves. So we're looking specifically at participatory action research or peer research. Again, the definition, peer research is research that is steered and conducted by people with lived experience of the issue being studied. And we'll come back to lived experience, because it's one of the key things when it comes to recruitment. It's generally mostly qualitative research. The young people are trained as researchers and then given that power through the training and the knowledge to make decisions about the process itself. And the main value of it, from my view, is also it empowers them and take control of the research. So it's their findings, it's their analysis, and they have a sense of ownership over the reports or the key findings. So therefore, they can go on to argue it or lobby or campaign for change based on it. So that engagement of them from the beginning to the very end is really, really important, because they become change makers based on it. So I put some additional reading as well from the McPinn Foundation, who do a lot of this stuff, and a basic sort of stage research method of what is participatory research in the academic sense. But any questions you have, just put it in the chat. Yeah, so do we have any questions about that first bit, Troy?
No questions so far. No questions so far. So yeah, I posted in the chat, everybody, that if you do have any questions, just put it in there, and yeah, we'll read them out at the end of every section.
Okay, great. So the second one, we're going to have a look at why use participatory approaches, what the benefits and drawbacks are. So I've got a more detailed PowerPoint which I'll send you, which has a lot of the things I'm saying. But to keep it simple, so when looking at participatory research, it's not simply just doing a piece of research for, data analysis or a needs analysis or data gathering about a specific area or locality. It's also can be used for a range of things. So evaluating services to see if services are running well, thinking if you want to design a service or a program, getting a peer research, participatory research process at the beginning to help you design that, make better suit the needs of the young people that it's going to be working with. So there's loads of ways you can add that qualitative participatory research in the work that you're doing. So the first main one is about question formulation. So depending on the methodologies that the young people use, generally when it's surveys or interview guides or focus groups, the main thing that most of the organisations that we spoke to talked about was question formulation. So generally we understand around language. Usually this pertains to simplifying language or not using jargony, policy, wonky words when it comes to wording questions, which is true. But also it's around that local knowledge or that intimate knowledge of that particular issue from their lived experience. So especially when it comes to follow-up questions where the organisations have less control over that process. Organisations can hold that survey and make sure it is out of the standard before it's sent out, but the true power of question formulation in a peer research context is when they're doing in-depth interviews or a focus group. That ability to do a follow-up. So we did a piece of research in Harrow, for example, which was around community safety, and one of the peer researchers was asking them where do they feel safe in the unsafe in the area, and the young person mentioned a park. I've never been to Harrow. I've spent most of my time south of the river. I don't know anything about it. But the peer researcher lived in that area, knew the park, and could ask, oh, that park, is it by this road, the one without the lamp? He knew exactly the layout of the park and already had an understanding of where they might feel unsafe, which opened them up and you've got far better data. So it's that intimate knowledge that means their follow-up question formulation is usually far, far better. And as a result, you get better qualitative data. But one of the main things about getting better quality data, which came up time and time again, is this idea of trust. When the person is being questioned by a young person who is doing it voluntarily because they care about the subject and have lived experience and can empathize with the challenges or whatever they're talking about, generally people tend to be more open because there's a sense of authenticity. So they're more willing to talk to peer researchers and go into a bit more depth. So the transcripts that you find that the peer research are doing, even if they haven't been doing peer research or qualitative research for 3 or 4 years, their transcripts tend to be better than mine because people talk to them more openly than they do for me. And that's one of their greatest advantages. We also get a better sample. So obviously youth organizations with their networks can go and get surveys filled in, but actually some of the better sample comes from when those young people are really engaged. You get a snowball sample effect where they will ask their friends and their friends will ask their friends. You get access into schools that you might not have access to. You get access into youth clubs and centers if they're engaged in that. And ultimately, the more sense of ownership they have over it, the more they want to succeed. So when we talked to several organizations who had a target in terms of survey sample, it was about 100 or 1,000. Every single time that they had peer researchers involved, they had a far larger sample size than for their non-participatory approaches, because those young people just went out and did that work. The next one is terms of authenticity. So this one comes up really again and again and again. It's probably the most common word that people said in interviews, and it's really hard to define, but it's a sense that it's much easier in terms of funding perspective and talking to your funders and justifying the work that you're doing when young people are involved throughout all of it. But also the work feels more authentic, especially if you get them involved in the analysis and the report writing stage. So the report and the key findings are in their words, and you're doing case studies or interviews with them. And actually the main thing that we always push is that all the reports are co-authored by those young people. You get them within the capacity of your organization to do as much as possible and to take as much on as possible. So it really does come from them. And if you completely do that as much as possible, you get their unique perspective on it. So then a unique perspective in terms of question formulation, but also data analysis. So if they're doing content and thematic analysis, the most important thing about that is their unique perspective. So we will do a data analysis, we'll have 20 transcripts with our group of peer researchers, and we all have to highlight things with different themes. And the themes we come up with are completely different to them, and they do genuinely see things that we wouldn't have identified in the first place, which stirs a conversation which, you know, we would be more minded around sort of meat data or whatever it is, and they'll find the kind of grey area or the nuance. It's really interesting, actually. So I won't read all of this. This is about an interview with a peer researcher for a piece of work that we did with Young Women's Trust, valuing young women's unpaid work. They had 6 peer researchers from across the country, and the training was done digitally, and it was about 6 months. They met together 1 or 2 times for the analysis. So this kind of goes on the last point. They said, you know, are there any ways you could think about making the process easier or more effective for future process? I think that doing peer research over the phone helps young people to open up. Not being face-to-face, they seem to talk really freely about their experiences, and they might have been shy to do it in real life. So also digital means can do it. But then the first one is the one that I'm supposed to go for, which is I felt that they could relate to me more. We were equals and understood the difficulties I was interviewing about. I wasn't some stranger in a white coat asking questions about something that I didn't have any lived experience or personal knowledge on. I could provide small snippets of I know what it's like, I've been in that situation, which I hope comforts young women. So that's kind of the value of having them in that situation. So in terms of the benefits of the young people themselves, I think there's loads. So trying to categorize it down to 3. Those are quotes from organizations when we asked them this question about what the benefits were. The first one, quite obviously, is research skills. So young people being taught about interview questions, focus groups, survey designs, but actually more importantly, they're being taught about the process itself. So what a research question is, how do you come to a research question? How do you set your research aims? Who do you choose to speak to? Who do you make your participants? And also analysis. So how do you analyze things? How do you actually get key findings from just talking to people? And all of those things are really, really important, especially for certain young people, if you do your recruitment right, who don't necessarily want to go to university, aren't that interested in research. It kind of is illuminating and empowering to see how decisions are being made. And research skills can be very theoretical, which we'll come on to, especially around ethics, but there is a way of doing it in an engaging way. Secondly is soft skills. I think one of the most remarkable things is the soft skills that they gain over the course of the process. Not necessarily through the training that you provide, but actually doing the field work. So in this one, someone says, in terms of confidence, some people were very quiet, but by the end, when they were doing practice interviews with each other, they would talk to people they didn't know in the group. Some of these peer researchers will be going out and interviewing people they've never met before and having to talk to them about kind of complex things in challenging ways. And by far, it puts them all out of their comfort zones. And as long as you're there to support them to manage any risks, you do see a massive change. I mean, I can teach someone about interview skills over hours, but actually after 3 real life interviews, then you see them really progress with it. And every single research project we've done, I can guarantee that they're all still friends and they all still talk to each other. 1, because they're brought together by lived experience, so they all have something in common. But 2, because they go through that adversity of going into a completely strange place and having to talk to people about things that usually they might not be asked. And it's quite interesting to see those friendship groups last. And the third one's about empowerment and agency. So instead of just constantly being consulted on something or asked their opinion on something, they are now in the driving seat of the change. They are the ones who are thinking about the questions they want to ask others. And if you take them through that entire process, from research question setting to actually showing them the aim, to the launch event where they present the aims and talk to people about their experiences, it is really empowering, especially if it's a very narrow specific subject or in a certain specific borough or locality or ward. They get to see the difference that they make in it, and they understand the process. And at a time in which there's more cynicism about the establishment and how power and decisions are being made, I think it's a really, really important tool that this is a way that we reintroduce youth voice back into young people's processes. So as an example of that, I mean, so we did one with young parents in London living with precariousness, and it was kind of a normal qualitative research project, but then we had 2 young people who were trained as peer researchers, and they still remain friends today. There's a WhatsApp group, which I really need to leave, which is still messaging on, but you know, I don't want to leave, enough to get left. So they're still friends, and that was like 2 years on, and they were fantastic. We saw them go into different rooms and talk to other young parents. One was a young father, and he would talk to young fathers about their issues. One was a young mother, similarly, and their follow-ups are great. And that was the first time where we thought, okay, this is a really great way. We want to do this all the time, because their transcripts were the body of that report in some respects. It was really where we got the best data. And it was quite easy to do as well, because they were 23, 24, their soft skills were already in a good position. We just needed to do some basic training skills, and we got them involved in the writing, and it just made the whole thing a lot more authentic and a lot more genuine, I think. So, I mean, I'll just touch on some of the challenges of participatory work, because there are a few. I mean, the first one is recruiting can be more challenging. Because recruitment, you need to have specific lived experiences. We'll get into it in a minute later on, but recruitment can be harder or a longer process. Secondly, giving over control to the young people, which actually is quite challenging because we have funders that have certain requirements and certain outputs. Giving full control over those young people might be difficult. So there becomes a balance between prescription and user-led. So if you know that your piece of research has to be about youth unemployment, then that's what it will be. So how much control you can give over to them is the really interesting thing, especially when you're giving them control over the process. If you give them control over the process around methodology, for example, that's where it becomes difficult to plan or predict. Because if they just choose a survey, then that's a 1-month process. If they choose a focus group, that's going to take far longer in terms of organizational and training. So because you don't know what that process is going to look like, it's very difficult to, 1, adequately budget for it, 2, actually write a grant for it without a funder who's aware of the process and the flexibility needed, and 3, also plan for how much time it's going to take. And as a result, sometimes training can be inadequate to prepare them. I think the difficulty with this is it is quite theoretical, but there is a lot of strong research skills that are needed in it. So proper training around research skills is necessary. So sometimes it can be quite quick. We'll just train, you know, some projects we talked to would just train them in surveys and, you know, the interview process, and that didn't give them meaningful control over the process itself. And also, I think there is an underestimation about how difficult it is to do in-depth interviews and focus groups. Teaching them about focus groups doesn't mean that they'll have those soft skills to go out there and run a focus group. And sometimes I feel like there is a danger with throwing them into the lion's den a little bit. The training really needs to be in place. Generally, throughout all of our projects, what we always say is whatever they're doing, interviews or focus groups, they will always be accompanied with a person from the organisation, someone who also does research to support them through that, because getting them to do it alone is really difficult. Also, change needs to be built in from the start. There needs to be a clear sense of what will change as a result of the research. So for the Harrow work that we were talking about, there was already buy-in from local stakeholders and the A&E department from the NHS who'd agreed to put a budget behind to look at enacting some change based on their findings. I mean, that's really important in terms of an engagement process because it keeps them engaged. They know what the end is, they know why it matters, and they know what will come at the end of it. But also it's a double-edged sword because if you buy their engagement in with this process, but nothing comes as a result of it, it's more disillusioning and disengaging, and it's probably worse than if you didn't involve them at all in some respects. Last one, one of them is about communications in young people. This came up around WhatsApping. How do you keep engaged with them? Do you WhatsApp them? What's the level of communication, digital communications, and constantly having to talk to them? And so if your process is 6 months, how often are you going to be WhatsApping them? That can be quite a challenge. It's not clear sometimes because it's an ongoing process. Because they become a family, they become a community, they want to eat together, they want to have dinner together. And how much do you kind of put hands-on management of that? And the last one, which we'll go over in a minute, is about safeguarding and ethics and how that in a research context can be quite difficult. So that's part 2. Troy, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few. So yeah, we've got one from Elizabeta, and she said regarding recruitment, how do you select young people? Do you do interviews, chats, one-to-ones, applications?
Okay, great. So I will go on to that in the next bit. So I'll definitely answer that into the next bit. So don't worry about that. Interviews. Yeah, is there another one?
Yeah, there's one from Young Camden Foundation, and they said, does participatory funding have the same characteristics as participatory research? And if so, can we have information about the structure and process of participatory funding?
Sure. So the PowerPoint that I'll send around actually has 2 slides about participatory funding, which I took out for time. But participatory funding is kind of a newer thing to participatory research in some respects. I think a good example, if you want to learn more, is Islington Giving, who are doing it in North London. So generally, they have their own pot of funding, which is community generated. And what they've decided to do as an organisation is pick up a section of that funding and set up something called the Young Grant Makers. So they train young people to make decisions about where funding should be placed in young people's services in Islington. And we did an interview with them for the peer research review, and it is a really interesting model. But they have complete flexibility over that funding because it's their own internal pot. So, it's wonderful that they can do that. They have the freedom to. I think one of the biggest challenges, and there's the biggest discourse about that, which hasn't quite been solved, is this sort of age-old professionalism argument again, because there is a danger where you recruit them for their lived experience because they have kind of an authentic, genuine sense as young people who live in that area and they know the challenges, but then also you want to train them in how to do grant making as funding managers, and that becomes a tension. So when we talk to participatory grant making programs, there is always at some point a disagreement between the professional funding managers who kind of look at the outputs and they think about value for money and the quantitative statistics of where the need is in the borough, and then the young people that they've recruited who kind of want something based on that, whether it's a music studio or whatever, and there's always that tension. So how much you give over control to them is a challenging question because sometimes you just end up prescribing it. So some participatory grant makers, they narrow the field down already. They get their funding managers to narrow it down so that 90% of them have been cut, and then they get the young people to choose from the remaining 10% of things that they feel are viable. But then how meaningful that is, I don't know, it's kind of an unknown. But yeah, I will send around more links around participatory grant making after this. Is there any more questions?
Yeah, I guess you're going to touch on this in the next part, but Emma said, how do you ensure safeguarding of young people may talk openly about issues in their area, and it is being published?
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about safeguarding around re-traumatization. So I'll remember that. Any other ones? No, we move on.
Yeah, we can hold off for now.
Okay, great. So yeah, hopefully I'll go over about recruitment and a bit of the safeguarding now. We want to do safeguarding ethics, I think, as a separate webinar in a bit more detail at some point, but we'll touch on some of the issues. So first one, thinking about meaningful participation in terms of recruitment. So one of the main things that comes up again and again and again, which is one of the most key concepts of participatory approaches, is this idea of lived experience. So lived experience refers to representation of the experiences and choices of a given person and the knowledge that they gain from these experiences and choices. So having the lived experience of that issue, another term that people use is experts by experience. They become experts in that subject because they have lived it rather than read data about it or whatever. So how you define lived experience for that project and how narrow it is kind of a movable feast, and it depends, but we'll go into it a bit more. So on the right is a bar chart of all the organizations we spoke to and how many peer researchers they had involved in the project. It's a bit of a mixed one. So generally, I mean, it's not so clear there. The mean was about 8. The highest frequency was 7. So the majority of them had 7 peer researchers. Generally, there was a consensus that any more than 12 becomes difficult. And that's because it's harder to make meaningful participation when you have more than 12. If you were just getting them involved in disseminating or conducting a survey, sky's the limit, have more hands on board, it's fine. But if you want them to actually think about what they want to ask and what questions they want to ask and analysis, it becomes a bit unwieldy when there's more than 12. Any less than 5, and then you end up being kind of, very susceptible to the very possibly misrepresentative sample of experiences within those 5 young people. Obviously, if those 5 are really well represented, you can do it. There was another tension between equalities and diversity of experience. So some organizations were more interested in getting geographical representation and equalities, so looking at race, gender, socioeconomic groups, self-identified where they could, while other organizations didn't look at that stuff and they were more interested in what's the diversity of experience. So talking about, were you a care leaver? Have you moved from one school, from one borough to another, that transition of what it's like to move different school? Have you moved here from another country, then entered secondary school? Very specific lived experience rather than the equalities. I think it's not an either or process though. You can do both, obviously, but it depends on your recruitment because it might take longer. So thinking about the recruitment process in general, on the right is a bar chart, pie chart of all the recruitment process and how long they took. One took 11 months, which was very particular, a bit of an outlier, but generally they take 1 to 2 months. The difference between the 1 to 2 to 4 months generally was based on their existing relationships in the community of which they were researching. So people who did 1 month recruitment process, they had those networks in those space and place that young people are or in those communities already. So the 4 weeks was basically sent advertising it, doing whatever their process was and kind of recruiting them at the end of that. If it took 2 to 4 months, generally it was more they needed to build those relationships first. So if they were doing a piece of research on care leavers, they would need to spend 5 weeks building those relationships with virtual school heads. And if they were going into a certain community they didn't have links in, they need to build those first. I think the second thing is around referral and self-referral. So in terms of the questions of how they were recruited, generally all the organizations had an introductory day. So they invited as many key stakeholders as possible, invite as many young people as possible, where they set out what the research was, what the process is, what they're hoping to achieve. And then they would have a mix of referral and self-referral. So they'll have self-referral where any young people interested on the day can sign up. They'll do some on-the-ground youth work. They'll put some flyers in places and get people to self-refer to the process. But then they'll also talk to specific key gateholders such as teachers, youth workers and clubs who think they might benefit from the process and aren't the usual suspects. The tricky thing with self-referral is you tend to get people who, again, already want to go to university and do research of some kind. And, we spoke to one example where they self-referred, they had referrals in from teachers in a single school, and they got 3 girls referred from this school, and they're all from the same psychology class. So the sample was really, really narrow. But self-referral is also difficult because you tend to get overrepresentation based on your network. One strategy that I quite liked is one organization tended to get them to recruit in pairs. So you recruit one and you tell them to bring a friend. That wasn't so much for the sample, but it was really good for retention and re-engagement throughout the entire process. And also you get a snowball sample. So the friend that they might bring might not be someone who would have engaged through the referral or self-referral process. So generally that's how it was done. Referral tends to be more done when there's a lack of time as well, because self-referral can be quite difficult and take maybe longer than 4 weeks, depending on how widely you're casting the net. In terms of the questions that you'd ask them interviews, most of those organizations would have a phone call conversation with them for 20 minutes to see where their aim's at, what they want to learn, what they want to get out of it. And then kind of like an interview process, they would take them onto it and answer any questions that they had. The one that a few organizations did that wasn't very common was a recruitment like a job process. So interview process, advertising it like a job. But these were generally organizations that had more flexibility. So it was paid like a job. They put them onto PAYE system and they got an email and everything. So it's more like a job. And as I said, snowball recruitment when people bring friends. And there is always, again, just like participatory grant making, this challenge between lived experience and professionalism. So some people are more interested about lived experience and getting those young people who really had those that lived experience of whatever they were researching, while others said, well, actually, we're going to train them in unconscious bias and asking objective questions. And actually, we don't want them so much to bring their lived experience to it. It's kind of a tricky one, to be honest. I think you can't professionalize them too much. You want their lived experience, not just in the follow-ups, but also their perspective when doing the interview questions. So, I mean, we'll talk about this a bit later, but again, what we define as lived experience we'll get into. So in terms of representative sampling, so there's two kind of ideas about representative sampling. There's one from a research perspective about the sample that you're getting to do the surveys, to talk to in the interviews, to do the focus groups. And there's also representative sampling about sampling those peer researchers that you're actually recruiting to do that. Generally, I think it's more important to always make sure the sample of the people that you're interviewing or doing the sample of the surveys is more important. If you're doing a survey, then geographical representation, all of that stuff is perfect and most important. When you're thinking about the representative sampling of the actual peer researchers itself, it's less of too much of a concern. I think the most important thing is as long as there is a representation of diversity within those peer researchers. Doesn't matter if it's kind of skewed one way or the other, as long as you have that represented, then it's okay, because they can hopefully, through that process of talking and thinking about the research questions, it will be kind of the job with the organization to facilitate those viewpoints. So everyone is kind of brought in and there's kind of an equality between those participants. So it's less an important thing when representing those young people, as long as it's kind of relatively representative. And again, the thing I was talking about with lived experience being narrow. So I think the most dangerous thing when it comes to that idea of representativeness is what is representativeness when it comes to young people. So one of the things that people do is they'll recruit a bunch of young people to recruit about young people's issues. And actually the diversity within London, even within a single borough, is huge. The diversity between a 15-year-old and 24-year-old is huge. So this idea that you can recruit 7 young people that are from 17 to 20 and they can speak for an entire borough, or, you know, if you're doing a needs analysis, all the issues within a single borough, is really tricky, especially if you're only working with sort of 7 young people, which is kind of the ideal. So, you know, initially we were going to do an idea around economic inequality. We've had to super narrow it down, because that's what you need to do. Because how can 7 young people really truly represent the wide gamut of economic inequality issues for young Londoners? It's impossible. So the more narrow it is, the better. We're doing a piece in Lewisham in September, and it's taking place on one estate. You can walk it from 2 minutes from one end, 2 minutes the other, and it's 18 to 25. That super narrow focus means that they have that experience, they know those people, they already have some relationships and trust there, and they can speak to that kind of, when it comes to data analysis, they're going to be far stronger on it as well. You know, we've done other pieces where I feel like the young people were just recruited because they're young people, and actually some of them have biases. So you had 2 young people in the group who had experience of knife crime in the police, and their analysis and ideas were so much different to those young people who did end up kind of having more of a media perspective on it. And, you know, it was a real argument between that and really difficult to manage and kind of interesting, but not ideal in terms of analysis. So again, it's about experiences rather than geographical distribution. If the geographical distribution is really narrow, then that's fine, because then you can say a certain thing. But again, like saying just Islington, it's hugely different. either end. So it's about their experience of Islington rather than just where they are. So kind of, I'll touch on this really briefly around the participatory process. So you don't have to do every single section of it. There is a real debate about at what point does it stop being meaningful. So, I mean, if I go through the whole thing, you do the introduction to the project, then you get them to design the process. So what does the process look like? How long are we doing this? How often are we meeting? What are the meetings going to look like? What do you want to do? So that's setting the aims and objective. What are the aims of this project? What are the objectives that we're trying to achieve? Then you design the evaluation with them. So actually the majority of projects we talked to didn't do an evaluation process with the young people. The focus tends to be on the research rather than the benefits for them. But actually designing the evaluation up with them is really good. It kind of gives them over control about what they want to learn, and you can design the training based on that. What do they want to get out of it? They might not all want the same things. You might have to train them in different things. Then deciding on the methodology itself. So most organizations have one prescriptive methodology. They want a survey to get that big quantity of data. But outside of that, what do they want to do? Do they want to do interviews? Do they want to do focus groups? Do they want to do an arts-based approach? Qualitative methods, there's so much that they can do. And it's kind of organizations' job to kind of teach them about it in a meaningful way. You need to teach them first about it and then get them to make a decision on which ones sound best for them. And once they've decided on the methodologies, they need to design them. So how many interviews are we doing? What focus groups? Designing the interview guides. How are we going to ask them? Where are we going to ask them? How many what geographical people do you want to speak to? What communities? So specifically doing the interview guides is the most common one there. Then conducting the field work. So in terms of conducting the field work, generally we always support them in the field to do it. People use incentive measures, so like a prize. So they, like a Survey Monkey, there's a link and they do a Survey Monkey link and they post who's completed the most surveys every single week to kind of incentivize it. That kind of depends on the methodology, the level of support needed. Conducting the analysis, this is one that organizations don't do very often, but bringing back all of the transcripts and not just crunching the data and giving them the key findings, but actually giving them control over the data and asking them what the key findings are. Generally, this is done in more of a co-production way because sometimes young people don't have those research skills to do that analysis. But obviously, if there's ideal amount of time, teach them about phonetic analysis, teach them about coding, and get them to decode some of the transcripts. And then supporting them writing the report. So whether they write chunks of it or do case studies or just specific bits, or if they've got more of an art-based feel, get them to write some communication stuff for it, and then campaigning on the findings. So the thing to note about this is that you don't need to do all of this to make meaningful participation, but it's for organizations, it's kind of, again, movable feast. So if you get them just to campaign on the findings, then obviously it's not a meaningful participatory process. Generally, the earlier on, the more early decisions they make, the more sort of meaningful it is. If you just get them to do supporting of the writing, they haven't done any of the research. Some organizations generally have the aim and objectives already and get them to design the methodology and design and to conduct the field work, which is still quite participatory because they're choosing the questions. But again, it depends. Again, I've gone over this qualitative approaches, just surveys, in-depth interviews, focus groups, participant observation, where they go in and write, and arts-based approaches. In terms of structure of training, again, this is about how long they've done it. So generally the time is about 7 hours, although some spent 20 hours, some spent 18. They range anywhere from like 1 day every week for a month to 3 days back to back for 2 weeks, kind of all over the place. Generally, you can't leave them for more than 2 weeks, though. You can't do one training and then 3 weeks later do another training. Once training is started, it tends to need to be quite, intense. Generally, I find it's better to train less and more in depth for what you need. So if they're not doing focus groups, don't teach them focus groups. Teach them only what they're going to do. Also, staggering, I think, is quite nice. A lot of organizations do lots of training all up front, and it gets a bit theoretical and it gets a bit kind of boring eventually. So if you stagger it, so you train them as and when it's needed for what they're about to do, it grounds it in reality. So if you already organize the focus groups and then you do the training for focus groups the week before they have to do it, then it gives it a sense of urgency and you can do a two-parter. So the first morning you teach them about focus groups, the second, and in the afternoon, you get them to design the questions they'll be asking the week after next. It kind of breaks it up and grounds the theory. And then lastly, this is the thing that I was saying before around training versus field work. How much do they actually learn in training? They learn the theoretical stuff, but actually how to do it, it's all in field work. which makes them a really good asset for future projects. It's quite a lot of investment in terms of young people if you only use them once. But if you use them as a cohort to train the next cohort or to go on to do other bits of research over the course of a year, then actually I think it's really, really, good budget. All right, last slide on this section is terms of additional support. So the first thing is being supportive to different young people's needs. Not everyone is interested in research. Not everyone wants to do analysis. Some people have different ideas. So there's a challenge between whether you train them in everything, everyone and everything, or do you be more selective and specific? So you give them roles and give them selective training based on that. Also non-project related support, because it can be really challenging. Some of the challenges, things they'll talk about, safeguarding, I'll get on to the next bit. And digital tools, we assume that young people are great with technology, but specifically like how to send data privately, and all of that is difficult. Make sure that's all clear, so you have to teach them that. Ensure they have the right equipment, so not just pens and pencils, but if they're going out and recording, make sure they have recording devices. You might want to record it on your phones or get them to do a recording app, but if there's challenging safeguarding issues, they might not be able to record those conversations. You need separate recording devices for that. And also general stuff around transport logistics. It's more traditional youth work stuff. One person said one of the biggest challenges is I've become a full-time travel agent, because just making sure that people are in the right place for the right time to do the focus group or whatever can be a challenge. Right, that's the longest. Remunerations, sorry. So in terms of payment, so the majority, 60% did pay young people, 30% paid them London living wage of more. They can come in vouchers, cash, bank transfers and other forms of incentives. Generally, people paid vouchers because there's a lot of uncertainty around how it affects benefits. Technically, the legal advice is if you pay them in vouchers, it does count as cash and they should be reporting it to HMRC. So it's kind of difficult about how we pay them without coming across any of those challenges. So a lot of them would end up doing voluntary with like a £50 token at the end of a certain amount of time. But then if you work it out by hourly wage, it was less than £10 an hour. So it was more of a token. So Troy, before we do the last section, which is about 5 minutes, really quick, is there any questions on that bit?
Right. Jean asked about incentives and support for peer research. I think you just touched on that. Rachel asked if you could point us in the direction of training and workshops for young research.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, for Sia's point, hello Sia, we'll do support for peer research, and thinking about the additional holistic support that they need is something that we haven't quite thought about as much yet, because we've been so much training the research side of it. But actually a whole offer, and whatever model there is, there needs to be that additional holistic support. And I'll get into safeguarding again, but that's particularly important. So let's think about that. In terms of training, yes, once this coronavirus thing hopefully abates, we actually have a training offer where we support small and medium-sized organisations to conduct their own peer research. We've supported 6 in the past year and a half, and we hope to support another sort of 3 or 4 coming up. So we do individual workshops, or we do the entire process. So just send me an email, which will be at the end of the slideshow, and we'll do that. We'll sit down about your project. And that goes for anyone as well. And we also do one-to-one conversations if you want to talk more just on the phone about your project and how you can embed participatory approaches in some aspect of your work. Then we're really happy to talk about it, because we're very aware that this is an introduction and it kind of is showing you like as a whole project. But actually what we're keen on seeing is how can you embed it in smaller ways across the work that you do, rather than this giant gold user-led standard all the time. Is that all the questions, Troy?
Yeah, that's it. You answered the last 2 questions, but basically, are you offering training to organizations, and who's the best person?
Okay, great. So last one, quick 5 minutes, just about some of the challenges. So firstly, it's about budget. That's where kind of the resources, it's quite difficult. On the left, we've got a budget breakdown. This is 20 organisations. Generally, the budget was about £30,000. That was the most common one. That includes the staffing costs. Some of the more expensive ones, about 55k. The cheapest it was done was for about £25,000. It's really tricky because all of these are different lengths. So the 55k one was for a year. The 25k one was for about 3 or 4 month project. And it depends on the level of involvement and how many young people they got. Generally, the medium is about £30,000 for about 4 or 5 months, but all of them were quite big projects, actually. We didn't speak to many hyper tiny projects. In terms of no staffing, when it's more core costs and it's something that you want to embed in your work, 15,000 was probably the most common. So that included the cost of their transport, paying them for the research, paying for any equipment costs, launches. If you didn't have those research skills in-house, getting someone to do the transcripts for you, and also report design. So 15 grand is about that. I've spoken to projects since that can do under, but they already have those in-house skills to do it. In terms of funding for sources and staff, the majority of the people we spoke to got it from independent funders, some from local government, some larger ones doing it from core funding and local authorities. There is some participatory work being funded by local authorities, again, because it's really difficult to plan. It's really trickier to get local authority funding because you don't know what's going to say at the end of a report, which local authorities can feel quite uneasy about, because it might say things that they don't want to say. And independent funders, I feel like a lot more funders are coming on with participatory approaches and are being a lot more flexible, but it's kind of, yeah, it's still difficult because you're not quite sure what the outcomes are. And by local government, we mean the GLA. So the GLA did a citizens-led engagement program where they funded 20 organisations a year for 2 years so far, and it's still going, to do specifically participatory approaches in the community. In terms of member of staff working on the project, it generally tends to be one full-time member, two for larger projects with one person supporting the young people in terms of communication, engagement, events, making sure they arrive, and one person kind of leading the project and the research side of it. But again, this is kind of a misleading one because in busier times, you know, maybe the report writing stage, you would have people chipping in. So you'd have 6 or 7 people working on it at different stages, but 1 or 2 holding it throughout. So this is the last slide, and it's just about the limitations of the approach. So I kind of touched on some of it before, where it's best used when the scope of the project is narrow. The broader it is, and the broader the sample of the young people, the less meaningful it tends to be. It's great to get them to participate and the benefits for them are huge, but if they don't have that lived experience or whatever, what they bring to it may not necessarily be beneficial or meaningful. It just becomes like a good research process done by young people. It also relies on existing soft skills. So as a shorthand, what people tend to do is they recruit the peer research and they see who's the most chatty and who's the most talkative, and they choose that one to do the focus group, because they already have those existing soft skills. It can be really difficult to get them to a place where they can go into a room and chair 7 young people. It's really, really hard, I think. So how we think about building in additional soft skills into the training, so it's not just research training, but also stuff like public speaking, which we have tended to do on the campaigning bit, but actually we think it needs to be at the beginning now. That really needs to be stronger. It needs flexibility from the actual organisation itself, and it's really challenging to work this way sometimes because you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's going to turn up, and also young people are really busy, so you might see dropout rate as well. So when people recruited 7 peer researchers, they tended to recruit about 10 and then expect 3 to drop out over the course of it. So having that flexibility and reacting to change really quickly is important, but can kind of make it quite limited. I know I haven't covered it as much, so I'm going to talk about the safeguarding as well, because I think I must have missed that out. I think safeguarding and ethics is really well understood within the youth sector, within kind of that context. But I think when you're doing participatory research with young people, safeguarding ethics has new considerations that I think are less kind of understood. So the question that someone was saying before, having challenging conversations, that's one of the biggest difficulties. So it's this idea of re-traumatization. If you're getting young people who have that lived experience of that challenge and they're going out and having challenging conversations about that, they could be re-traumatized because they have to think about all of the things that have gone on in their own life. That's really, really tricky. And the difficulty is you want to be specific in experience, but you can't be too specific. So, I mean, one thing is that people don't recruit young people who are still in receipt of services. That's like the obvious one. But then past that, it's really hard to see where the line is. Firstly, you also make sure that they have adequate support. They know who to talk to. You tell them if they're about managing risk. You teach them how to manage risk if they see it in the person they're interviewing, but also in themselves. You make sure that you're always in the interviews with them to make sure and read the situation and intervene where necessary. But it is a really challenging one. And ethics as well, I think research ethics aren't really well understood. They seem very, very kind of nebula and very theoretical, and it's really difficult to teach it sometimes. I think consent though, and consent around interviews, it's not just like teaching them to sign a consent form. It's about why it's important. So one activity I really, really liked that illustrates it is you've got all of the young people to write down one fact that they don't want anyone else in the world to know, that's really private to them, and they put it in an envelope, and then they have to give the envelope to the next person, and then you ask them how they feel about the other person having that. And it kind of just teaches them about why it's important that these kind of secure conversations stay secure. I think the tricky thing is you just go research ethics, this is a consent form, and it just doesn't engage, it just feels like admin that they have to do. And I think sometimes organizations feel like it is admin that they should be doing. You know, I'll just design the consent forms and I'll make sure it's all done, get the young people to do the fun stuff. But actually it's really important these young people know what the ethics are, design up the consent forms themselves, or understand why everything says what it is. Because then that also builds onto the safeguarding practice. You know, they're two interlinked. I think they're better safeguarded if they understand what the ethics is and the protections in place for the person they're speaking to, because then they hopefully understand the position that they're in and the protections there for them. Last two ones, so it depends on the networks as well. The quality of the research, the quality of recruitment depends on the networks and the reach of the organization. You just have to end up building relationships. But the participatory approach is really good for organizations looking to expand their networks, because you're going to have to anyway by going out there with a very specific piece for organizations to get involved with. And lastly, it's most qualitatively rich data. So organizations tend to want a sample because it gives them some sort of quantitative data, but participatory approaches is very much rooted in a qualitative history. So, you know, big data, quantitative analysis, and crunching numbers, this is not what it's there for. Generally, it's good at taking a big number of statistics and exploring in depth what that means for young people in that specific community or area. And that's where its strength is. Being too wide with it is difficult. So that's all of it. I'll do questions after this then. The next thing is the next webinar is on the 30th, based on the Mentimeter results. We'll send around a poll after this as well, if people can just say which one or rank which one's the most interested in, and then we'll try and talk about that in the next 45 minutes. Any suggestions you have about how we can make it more participatory would be good. But we had like 62 people booked on or whatever, so we were a bit worried that it might be quite difficult. But any suggestions people have? We have a peer research roundtable where we're releasing the peer research review, which is all the findings from the 20 organisations that we spoke to and goes over what I've spoken about, but in a lot more detail. That's happening on the 5th of June and will also be a webinar, I think, at this rate. And also we do one-to-one advice and training for organisations. That's my email. So thank you very much. I'll ask Troy, is there any other questions?
Yeah, we've got two more. Thanks for that, Matt. Okay, so from David, he asks, how about digital online training? And Ola asked a similar question, which is, do you have any advice on how to run virtual participatory research for young people?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing we've gotten asked for quite recently. So I think if more people are interested in it, I think we were going to do it. We were going to do a peer research toolkit in summer, and that was going to be a toolkit for organizations about how to run it with different models. But also as a part of that, we were going to properly, with proper cameras, film like the training for each individual section. So hopefully organizations can either learn from it and recreate it or show that themselves. But it feels like there needs to be a bit more now. So we will be happy to think about how we do some digital training. It does work. So we did it for Young Women's Trust. Most of it was recorded just very quickly on an iPhone, and it was sent to all the participants who couldn't be there. I think it is really important to have some degree of face-to-face or at least Zoom conversation or whatever that is at the beginning and for certain stages. So introduction stage, they need to talk to each other and get to know each other, and icebreakers, etc. Analysis stage, research question stage. So anything where they have to make decisions, you need to find a way that they can participate. I think Zoom does work quite well for that. You can do that if you have 7 or less participants. But I think for training in particular, you just get a webinar, whoever can sign in, you talk to whoever's there, but you make sure you record it and you make sure everyone watches it afterwards. So they don't always need to be there and present for the training itself. I think that works. I think that's what we're going to have to do for one of our projects. Hope that answers it. Is there any other questions?
That's it. That's it.
Perfect. Okay, so we've just run 3-4 minutes over. If there's anything else, please just feel free to email me. I'm not going anywhere. So any questions?